In a few weeks, Poland will inaugurate a new president, political newcomer Karol Nawrocki.
He doesn't appear to have that political baggage that other candidates might have. He's also an amateur boxer, and his campaign has regularly shown videos of him going to the gym, going to the shooting range. This is something I think that's also helped his image.
With war raging next door, the image of a strong leader has appeal.
Nawrocki has described Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a neo-imperial war. On the other hand, he is against NATO membership for Ukraine. Nowadays in Poland, anti-Russian sentiment coexists with anti-Ukrainian sentiment, so those are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Poland is a NATO member and backs Ukraine in this war. Scaling up security is an issue almost all Poles agree on, yet there are some signs of shifting attitudes. In this episode of the Global Jigsaw, we put the election discourse under the magnifying glass to understand how conflicting priorities and a distinctive set of values are shaping the eastern flank of the West. I'm Krassi Ivanova Twigg, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, exploring the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
The election of Karol Nawrocki as president doesn't actually change the current setup, whereby the prime minister and the president are pulling in different directions. Yet it has caused upset. We'll try to understand why with the help of Margaryta Maliukova from our Kyiv team, who's been based in Warsaw since the start of the full-scale war in Ukraine.
Right now, the president and the government in Poland represent two rivaling parties. The president, who is backed by the center-right, and the government is center-left, something called cohabitation. And it's already been the case for nearly 2 years that the current president, Andrzej Duda, has been vetoing some legislation that was passed by the center-left government. And some of this legislation was actually very critical as campaign promises.
The president is not just a ceremonial figure. By vetoing legislation, he can block the work of the government.
President Duda is backed by the Law and Justice Party, PiS, and the government is led by Civic Coalition. And for this reason, the government has really struggled to deliver on its election promises. Duda has blocked attempts by the Tusk government to restore judicial independence in Poland, and that was a key point of contention between Poland and the European Union. And another example is that Duda has blocked providing over-the-counter access to the morning after pill, as the government has been trying to liberalize the strict abortion laws in the country.
This cohabitation, which has put the pro-EU government in a straitjacket, reflects divisions in society that seem to be deepening. Karol Nawrocki secured his victory with a razor-sharp margin, having bagged just 50.9% of the votes.
Karol Nawrocki Tadeusz, 10,606,807.
It was so close that at first the losing side, Trzaskowski, declared victory.
Zwyciężyliśmy!
But by the morning, we learned that Karol Nawrocki had won.
Zwyciężymy I ocalimy Polskę.
The result was very close, and actually, if we analyze the past few elections, the result has become closer and closer. This year, the difference in votes was a little over 360,000.
Musimy zwyciężyć I wiemy, że tak się stanie.
And in 2010, the difference in votes in the runoff was 1 million votes. The campaign was deeply polarizing.
Gdzie nie chodzi tylko o członkostwo w Unii Europejskiej, w Sojuszu Północnoatlantyckim.
We've seen a lot of negative press about both of the candidates. And sometimes these were allegations that were quite dubious or unsubstantiated or citing anonymous sources. In other cases, those were claims that are easy to verify.
Karol Nawrocki został wezwany przed Sejmową Komisję Sprawiedliwości I Praw Człowieka.
But curiously, all this negative press seems to have helped Nawrocki because it made him look like he was unfairly targeted by the
W
press.
imieniu Polek I Polaków zwykłych, takich jak ja, którzy mają jedno mieszkanie. Natomiast
One example is Nawrocki saying in one interview that he has just one flat, he is just like regular Poles. This was a deeply strategic move, I think, because he understood that it's very important to present yourself as someone people can relate to. And analysts say that this was one of the reasons, actually, that Trzaskowski lost the election. Despite the fact that Trzaskowski speaks multiple foreign languages, he is still seen as a kind of elitist candidate who is detached from the concerns of regular voters.
The man who narrowly lost is Warsaw Mayor and former Foreign Minister Rafał Trzaskowski. He's regarded as one of the most trusted and popular politicians in Poland. Karol Nawrocki, on the other hand, is a new face. So how did he charm the electorate?
Nawrocki was not very well known before his nomination. He is head of the National Remembrance Institute. I think that's why the Law and Justice Party backed him in this election, because he doesn't appear to have that political baggage that other candidates might have. He is also an amateur boxer, and his campaign has regularly shown videos of him going to the gym, going to the shooting range. This is something I think that's also helped his image in this campaign, because opinion polls show that security is a key concern for voters, and they want a president who appears strong, not just in rhetoric, but also in physical strength.
And do you think this kind of macho side to him, the boxer and the man with a gun, appeals to the voters, particularly the male half?
Yes, there is a gender divide in this election.
In the runoff, more women went to vote, and 52.8% of them voted for Trzaskowski, while Nawrocki took 55.5% among men. And before we try to understand the gender divide, let's have a look at the other candidates to give us a broader idea of the views that have been gaining currency in Poland.
The third most popular candidate in the first round was Slawomir Mentzen. He got around 15% of the vote, and he represents the socially conservative and economically liberal Confederation Party, which is particularly popular with young people. And Mentzen really directed his campaign at young people, being especially popular on TikTok. Recently, his party has moderated its rhetoric and has become open to sexual minorities joining their ranks. Mentzen is an entrepreneur, and that's something that has also helped his image. In his campaign, he is seen as this man of success by some of his voters. He has a tax consultancy, but also a brewery. And one of his most popular campaign events is the so-called Beer with Mentzen, where he would invite voters and have beer with them. He has quite provocative rhetoric on some issues. And you can also see that provocative style in the names he chooses for his beers. For example, one beer is called White IPA Matters. That was not very well received in the West, for example, in some British media. But Mentzen has since said that, in fact, this media criticism of his beer actually boosted its sales.
Yet the far-right politician was himself outflanked by a candidate with a history of provocations.
The fourth most popular candidate is Grzegorz Braun, who polled 6%. Braun is openly anti-Semitic. He has put out Hanukkah candles with a fire extinguisher in the Polish Sejm.
Panie pośle, co pan robi?
So we looked him up. Grzegorz Braun, a current member of the European Parliament, has made a few appearances in national news. In one incident, he attempted a citizen's arrest of a doctor performing a legal abortion earlier this year. In another, he trampled on artifacts at an LGBT-themed exhibition in the Parliament.
It was really quite surprising that Poles would vote for him, and according to analysts, this is largely due to his staunch anti-Ukrainian rhetoric that has appealed to some voters.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's turn our attention to the biggest security issue for Poland, the war in neighboring Ukraine. Margaryta mentioned anti-Ukrainian sentiments earlier. When it comes to Russia, Poles have always stood firm, remembering the price they paid in World War II and afterwards, the mass killings and other repressions by the Nazi and Soviet regimes. It's because of this history that parts of Central and Eastern Europe became known as bloodlands. Yet even here, the election campaign produced some faint echoes of the Kremlin's loudspeaker.
Nowadays in Poland, anti-Russian sentiment coexists with anti-Ukrainian sentiment, so those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And for example, the radical right candidate Mentzen emphasized the strength of the army in his campaign, and he has emphasized the need to protect Poland from Russia, to keep Russia as far away from Poland's borders as possible. At the same time, he has echoed some of Trump's rhetoric when he called for a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And in one of the recent debates, Mentzen said it doesn't really matter to him where exactly this new border between Ukraine and Russia should lie. So that was something that was deeply concerning to Ukrainian commentators. But perhaps the closest to what you might call a pro-Russian position was Grzegorz Braun, who has spoken out against military aid for Ukraine and has called for normalizing relations with Russia and Belarus. But generally speaking, pro-Russian sentiment is quite marginal in Poland.
What is Nawrocki's attitude towards Russia?
Nawrocki has described Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a neo-imperial war.
Pokazuje imperializm myślenia dzisiejszej Federacji Rosyjskiej, bo oni w nowelizacji swojego...
He strongly supports military aid for Ukraine. On the other hand, he is against NATO membership for Ukraine and also against EU membership for Ukraine unless Ukraine and Poland resolve some of their historical differences. And just like the other candidates, Nawrocki opposes sending Polish troops to Ukraine. But that is generally a widely accepted position in Poland.
And there seems to be not much love lost between Russia and Nawrocki.
Curiously, also Nawrocki is on the wanted list in Russia.
Propagandowymi za likwidację pomników poza granicami Federacji Rosyjskiej grozi 3
because he removed some Red Army monuments in Poland while he was head of the National Remembrance Institute.
As for Poland's gripes with Ukraine, it's a growing list, and it all goes back to, you might have guessed it, World War II.
One of the long-standing points of tension between Ukraine and Poland is the so-called Volyn massacre, which was a series of mass killings of Polish civilians by Ukrainian nationalists between 1943 and 1945. There are just different estimates of how many people killed. Polish officials usually say 100,000 Poles were killed in the massacre.
Około 80 Polaków zamordowanych przez ukraińskich nacjonalistów.
Historians say it's between 60,000 and 100,000. Poland officially calls it the Volyn genocide, whereas Ukraine usually refers to it as the Volyn tragedy, because according to Ukrainian perspective, these were bilateral acts of ethnic cleansing.
Про правду і міфи, про причини і наслідки Волинської трагедії.
Ukraine emphasizes that some Ukrainians were also killed in retaliatory attacks by the Poles, although in far fewer numbers. And this Volyn massacre was perpetrated by the Ukrainian insurgent army, which was created by members of the radical wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists led by Stepan Bandera.
Part of the Ukrainian insurgent army opposed these killings and condemned them.
Bandera is often discussed in the context of these events, but actually he himself did not take part in this massacre because he was in a Nazi concentration camp at the time. He was arrested for proclaiming an independent Ukrainian state. And when it comes to Bandera, Poles widely condemn him as a murderer, as a Nazi collaborator. Whereas in Ukraine, in 2010, for example, Bandera was awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine by President Yushchenko, although this was later revoked by Yushchenko's successor.
Hero or villain, Stepan Bandera has gained prominence in the last few years. He and his supporters often featured in Kremlin narratives as justification for the need to denazify Ukraine by invading it.
And the other big concern for Ukraine is, of course, that Russia is exploiting this issue.
Бендеровцы и неонацисты, по сути, они действуют так же, как и террористы во всем мире.
So Ukrainians are wary of doing anything that might feed into the Russian narrative. And while Poland and Russia may agree that Bandera and the Ukrainian insurgent army were Nazi collaborators, from the Ukrainian perspective, that's a reductive reading of history, because the Ukrainian insurgent army fought not only against the Poles and the Soviets, but eventually also against the Nazis, when they realized that the Nazis were against the establishment of an independent Ukrainian state.
Українці не хотіли ні німецького, ні польського, ні радянського режиму на своїй землі.
From the Ukrainian perspective, the official Polish narrative doesn't fully account for the complexity of this period of history.
Ukraine and Poland may have a different reading of that chapter of their shared history, but there have been attempts at moving forward.
Under President Poroshenko, Poland asked Ukraine for some permits to exhume and rebury the victims of the Volyn massacre, and Ukraine refused to grant those permits. This April, Ukraine finally allowed for some exhumations. For Poland, this is not just a historical issue. They see it as a Christian duty to bury their dead. But for Ukraine, the Volyn massacre is part of a broader narrative. Ukraine wants Poland to recognize the events that led up to the Volyn massacre, the suppression of the Ukrainian identity under Polish rule, and other things.
The exhumation started in April. Does that mean that this issue is on its way to resolution between the two countries?
It was seen as a positive sign, but the exhumation took place on a limited territory. And Poland still wants some kind of official statement from Ukraine recognizing the genocide, which so far Ukraine has seemed unwilling to make.
So what is Nawrocki's position on that?
It appears to be a huge stumbling block, and Nawrocki has repeatedly said that Poland will not support Ukraine's membership in the European Union until the Volyn issue is resolved.
There are currently over 1 million Ukrainian refugees living in Poland. They were welcomed at the start of the war, but attitudes towards them have been hardening.
According to the latest polls, we see that only about half of Poles are in favor of accepting Ukrainian refugees. And just 2 years ago, the figure was over 80%. We also see these negative attitudes towards Ukrainians prominent among young people. We also see general decrease in support for military aid to Ukraine, for Ukraine's NATO and EU membership.
Why do you think this is the case, that Ukrainian refugees are not welcome anymore?
Analysts say it's a mix of objective and subjective factors. The objective factor is competition. There is indeed some competition for jobs, especially the lower paid ones. And one factor that's very important for young people is the increase in rent, which happened because of higher demand after the influx of Ukrainian refugees. There's also a lot of talk about healthcare, because refugees are granted free healthcare. And this is seen by some Poles as unfair because they have to pay taxes and then wait in long queues to get their medical appointments. Politicians on the radical right, especially Mentzen, often complain about the benefits being received by Ukrainian refugees in Poland.
What do we know about Nawrocki? Where does he stand on the issue of Ukrainian refugees?
I think Nawrocki has spoken in favor of limiting support for Ukrainian refugees, particularly financial support. And when it comes to the subjective factor, analysts point out that the war has negatively affected the economic situation in Poland, and some Poles blame Ukrainians for this.
The data somewhat contradicts the rhetoric. A report by the UN's refugee agency a few weeks ago said that Ukrainians have in fact given Poland a big economic boost, contributing more towards the economy than they take out in benefits. One area of friction is agricultural produce. After all, this region is also known as the breadbasket of Europe.
When the war broke out, the European Union lifted restrictions on imports of grain and other agricultural products from Ukraine. So this allowed for cheaper Ukrainian grain to enter the market and compete with Polish produce. In response, farmers in Poland protested, particularly by blocking the border with Ukraine. At one point, the protesters even spilled Ukrainian grain from a truck onto the road, which was quite infuriating for the Ukrainians, considering that the grain was collected during wartime and under constant threat of Russian shelling.
What's striking is that negative attitudes towards Ukrainians are particularly prevalent among Poles under the age of 24. the same youth vote that gave a boost to Nawrocki in the second round.
In the first round of the election, Slawomir Mentzen was the most popular candidate among young voters and got 15%, which means he was among the kingmakers. He could make or break the election and determine where the young votes would go. He organized 2 interviews with the 2 candidates who made it to the runoff, with Trzaskowski and Nawrocki. And these YouTube interviews were actually highly popular. They got as many views as the national debate between Nawrocki and Trzaskowski on TV.
W tym momencie najmniej istotne, bo wie pan, co jest istotne? Że jeżeli 8 000 osób...
Which also shows how important social media and online media are becoming in the election campaign.
Za każdy głos, za każdy powieszony baner, za przekonywanie swoich sąsiadów, za...
Eventually, Mentzen did not fully endorse one candidate or the other.
Dowiedzieli się, co pan myśli, co pan zrobi, jakie pan ma poglądy, a nie jakie poglądy ma Rafał Trzaskowski, bo to spróbuje dowiedzieć się w sobotę.
But everything he said indirectly suggested that he was essentially supporting Nawrocki more than Trzaskowski. Some Polish commentators pointed out that Trump's victory generally gave a boost to the right wing in Europe, and particularly to Nawrocki. Nawrocki has met with Trump, and Trump expressed support for him when he won the election.
What is Nawrocki's appeal to the young generation?
I think it was really his YouTube interview with Mentzen, because Nawrocki ended up agreeing with a lot of points that Mentzen was raising.
Czy pan się z tym zgadza?
Tak, ja generalnie jestem oczywiście przeciwko.
That he would not agree to raising taxes in Poland. Overall, I think it was a protest vote against the government, because the government has not been able to deliver on its promises, even though, as we discussed, that was partially due to the veto. And I do think there were objective economic factors, particularly for farmers who were unhappy with the influx of Ukrainian grain.
The success of the YouTube interviews confirms once again what we in the traditional media have been anxious about, that young audiences go elsewhere for their news. Those savvy enough to act on this knowledge through clear messages and dynamic digital presence reap the result.
If you look at how young people voted, the second most popular candidate among young voters under the age of 30 was a radical socialist, Adrian Zandberg.
I stąd jest ta kredytowa licytacja pomiędzy PiS-em a Platformą.
Zandberg focused his campaign on the housing issue, and this was something that was very appealing to young people, that spoke to their concerns. But I think Zandberg also represents this anti-system vote. He is a candidate outside of the 2 major parties, and that was, I think, another important issue in the election. The issue of breaking the so-called duopoly of the 2 major parties.
Dobrze byłoby dla Polski, żeby wreszcie rozbić ten duopol PiS-u i Platformy.
This was something that both Mentzen and Zandberg emphasized in their campaign, and it appears to have spoken to young people.
Young people seem to be breaking away not just from traditional media, but also from mainstream politics. There's a clear generational split, and there's also a clear gender split.
In the second round, the majority of women voted for Trzaskowski and the majority of men for Nawrocki. One of the big issues in the campaign was abortion. The previous government introduced a near total ban on abortion. And the current government has not been able to reverse it. Another factor driving the female vote is social policy. If we look at young female voters, their top choice in the first round was Adrian Zandberg. And in some interviews, young women explicitly linked this to concerns about housing prices. Overall, women do tend to vote for more liberal candidates in Poland, but it's not an overwhelming majority either, which reflects the endurance of conservative values in the country.
The gender divide in Poland reflects a wider trend. Recent studies and polls from across Europe suggest that young men and women increasingly drift apart in their worldview, with men showing a growing preference for far-right parties, while more women turn to the left. While the president of Poland does not lead on foreign policy, he could play a role in shaping it. So what do political analysts expect from the new president? Let's start with the neighbors.
One pro-Kremlin TV channel described Nawrocki as an anti-Ukrainian candidate. He was seen as someone who could sow chaos in Poland, but also in Europe. But on the other hand, Russian media remember that Nawrocki is on the wanted list in Russia. Some commentators describe him as a Russophobe. Some see him as an American stooge. In Belarus, before the second round, state TV said that this is a choice between two evils. And one Belarusian commentator described Nawrocki as an American Trojan horse.
As former Kyiv councillor Taras Shamaida put it, unfortunately, no miracle has happened. Poles did not use the opportunity to reject populism. But there were also optimistic voices in Ukraine saying the two countries have a common enemy, so they will have to maintain friendly relations and ultimately resolve existing tensions. Some analysts also say that Nawrocki's closeness to the Trump administration might actually help Ukraine. It might make Poland an advocate of Ukraine. Nawrocki's remarks on NATO are not very reassuring to Ukrainians, but some see this as purely campaign rhetoric, which is also a response to Polish people's fears of Poland being dragged into the war. Moreover, Trump has ruled out Ukraine's accession to NATO, so some see Nawrocki as simply laying out the facts honestly, while other politicians are making empty promises to Ukraine.
Earlier this month, the Tusk government survived a vote of confidence. The Prime Minister said it gave it a new momentum after it was shaken by the setback of the presidential election. And he announced a reshuffle in the summer. But even before the elections, there were signs that the pro-EU coalition was making a slight turn to the right.
TVP World with me, Anna Kalczyńska. Poland has launched a new information campaign aimed at discouraging illegal migration.
The Polish government, for example, was toughening migration laws. The government suspended the right of migrants arriving via Belarus to apply for asylum. The government also threatened not to comply with the EU Migration Pact. So you could see the rhetoric was shifting more to the right, and the whole campaign was shifting to the right, which was a huge change for the center-left government, which generally seeks closer ties with the European Union.
Like other former Soviet bloc countries, Poland's foreign policy priorities and enduring social conservatism make it a distinctive part of what we call the West, this entity defined by a set of liberal values. One Polish political analyst, Jarosław Kuisz, sees this as a battle between two Wests, two power centers that are ideologically very different. Let's hear more from Polish commentators about what lies ahead.
Polish analysts predict a lot of instability, and they even predict that the coalition might fall apart, that there might be an early election. And in that early parliamentary election, they predict that the right wing might take over. So we will have a right-wing president and right-wing government. But so far, it seems there will be a deadlock with the government continuing not to be able to deliver on its promises.
Journalist Mateusz Baczyński said, "It looks like we will have 2.5 years of vegetative state." And commentator Kazimierz Groblewski said the real winner in this election is the far-right candidate Grzegorz Braun, who he said would become more popular in the years to come. Groblewski said, when mainstream politicians over-sharpen their message, demons awaken, even those that seem to be buried forever.
Thank you to our Ukraine and Central Europe media analyst Margaryta Maliukova. This episode of the Global Jigsaw was produced by Kriszta Satori and me, Krassi Ivanova Twigg. The technical producer is Elchin Suleymanov. It was mixed by Hall Haynes and edited by Judy King. And check out our other episodes covering the region. As always, we like hearing from you. Our email address is theglobaljigsaw, all one word, @bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening.